The construction of this model is getting to the end now. This will be the last video for the construction or installation of items that go onto the shelter deck. After this, it's really main armament and rigging, and then we're done. All that needs to go on the shelter deck today are the UP launchers and the Mark 19 guns. Both of these components are 3D printed parts from MicroMaster. Of the two, the UP launchers are the simpler type. They are quite blocky and don't require any assembly. They just need to be removed from their base and then painted. Since they are very blocky, removal is incredibly simple. I use needle nose pliers to hack away at the bottom of the supports, and they fall off very easily. Once off the base and free of all their printing supports, a little bit of cleanup is required to their base just to ensure that those connection points to the 3D printing supports are fully removed and that there are no bumps. This is just going to make sure that the component sits nice and flatly on the deck. Moving on to the Mark 19 guns. These are marginally more difficult simply because it requires a tiny bit of installation. The mount for the gun and the gun are printed separately. Once again, these are fairly chunky components. It's not to say that they are low detail. The detail is very high. It's just that the structure of them is quite solid, so I don't need to be too careful with removing them from their base. They can handle quite a lot of abuse. At this point, I've now used quite a lot of different types of MicroMaster 3D printed parts, and I've always been quite surprised about how strong they actually are. Even the components that look very delicate are surprisingly strong. They're stronger than I expect them to be, at least. And these ones, since they are quite solid, are very strong. I have very little concern about damaging them while I'm removing them from their base. Anyway, after removing the mounts and the guns from the base, a little bit of cleanup is required in the same fashion as for the UP launchers. It's just the bottom of the mounts where the 3D printing support's attached. Those bumps need to be removed. Since the fit for these guns into the mounts for the Mark 19 guns is not a real concern, I will paint them separately. It is my preference to paint components separately, but if there's going to be a fit issue or some other issue, then I will assemble first and then paint. But in this case, there's none of that, so I'll go to my default position of painting, then assembling. For all of these guns and rockets, the paint scheme is the same, and it's the most simplest you can get. Everything is painted in XF53, the same color as HMS Hood's superstructure. After the XF53 coat has dried, everything is sealed in with Mr. Color GX112 UV cut super clear gloss varnish. I'm applying the gloss varnish now before assembly because I think once the guns are in the mounts, it's going to make it more difficult to get the panel line to go where I need it to go and then also to remove the excess. And as I said before, I'm not worried about fit, so I'm not worried about the marginally extra width that the paint is going to make these components. So while I normally assemble first and then weather, in this case I'm going to weather first and then assemble. After giving the gloss coat sufficient time to dry, panel line is applied. This panel line has been quite heavily thinned. It's roughly 2 parts solvent to 1 part panel line. This will make the panel line flow more easily towards the details and leave less residue to remove. After leaving the panel line to dry for around 20 minutes, the excess is then removed using a cotton bud. I'm using a cotton bud because it doesn't have the ability to get right into the details. I want to remove the panel line on flat, smooth surfaces, but leave the panel line concentrated around the details. I don't use a brush because a brush would be a bit too good at removing the panel line. Normally, after the solvent has evaporated and the components are fully dry, I'd move on to sealing everything in with the matte coat. But in this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to move to assembly. And the reason for that is that I'm going to glue the guns in place on their mount using super glue, and super glue is shiny, which means after I've glued them in place, I'm going to have to apply a matte varnish to hide that shiny glue. So instead of applying a matte varnish now and then gluing and then applying matte varnish again, I might as well install glue and then apply 1 coat of matte varnish at the very end. Installing these guns in their mounts is very simple. The fit is nice. I wouldn't say it's tight. I think firm would be a good way of describing it. it just sits in very snugly. You know that you've got it in the right position. It feels good, and everything is then well aligned once it's properly seated. And it's not very difficult to get it into that position. Visually, you can see into this area on the side of the mount, so you know when you've got its hinge in the right location. Since the fit is firm, I'm able to first simply install all the guns in the correct location and not glue them down. This allows me to get into a more of a production line mode where I go through a whole lot of positioning of guns on mounts, and then once all the guns are in the correct position, I then come back with extra thin super glue and I apply a small drop of thin super glue to the hinge using a wire. Now that the Mark 19 guns are fully assembled, I place them back onto my painting board, also known as an ice cream tub lid, and then seal everything in with a layer of Tamiya XF86 matte varnish. Once the matte varnish has dried, installation can begin. The first thing that needs to be done for pretty much all of these guns is to open up these holes in the deck a little bit. They are slightly too tight. Obviously, these are aftermarket components. They don't necessarily fit this model precisely. Fortunately, all that is required to get these components to fit nicely is to open up the holes using a 1.2mm bit on a pin vise. I'm going to start by installing the UP launchers. I did make 5 UP launchers in this video, however the 5th one goes on the roof of turret B, which is not yet ready, so I'm only going to be installing 4. These are the 4 that go on the shelter deck. The installation for all of these is exactly the same. First, I apply a small drop of thick super glue to the hole in the deck where the UP launcher should be placed, and then I place the UP launcher in the hole. Since this is thick super glue, it doesn't set immediately, and it gives me a little bit of time to correctly position and reorientate the UP launcher such that it is looking directly outward from the center line of the ship. I do need to do this quite quickly because although this super glue does dry fairly slowly for super glue, it still does set very quickly. Once the 4 UP launchers are in place, I move on to installing the 7 Mark 19 guns. The Mark 19 guns are installed using the same method that I used for installing the UP launchers. First, I place a drop of thick super glue in the hole in the deck where the Mark 19 gun should be positioned, and then I place the Mark 19 gun in its hole. Before I started installing the Mark 19 guns, I looked around just to see how these guns are positioned when they're not in use. From what I could find, all but one of the guns is positioned forward when not in use. The only one of these guns that was positioned facing aft was the aftmost gun, which makes sense because if it was positioned forward, it would be facing the aftmost pom-pom gun. With the installation of the UP launchers and the Mark 19 guns complete, the whole construction for the shelter deck of this model is now also complete. Naturally, that means that in the next video, I'll be moving on to a new area of the ship, and that area of the ship is finally the main armament. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.